Welcome to The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every week, we explore stories that are shaping the African continent. Some Nigerian leaders have argued that Western-style democracy does not work well in Africa. Former President Olusegun Obasanjo called for a new system. Meanwhile, the country's House of Representatives is considering 23 constitutional amendments to strengthen judicial independence. How can Nigeria create a democratic system that aligns with its cultural and political realities? Fulani herders farmers violence in Nigeria has escalated into a nationwide security threat, displacing 2.2 million people and devastating multiple regions. Climate change, deforestation, and government inaction has fueled the conflict. A new report by SBM Intelligence looks at this conflict and highlights the need for urgent actions to prevent catastrophic consequences for national stability, food security, and democracy. Developing countries face record high debt, with Nigeria's debt set to exceed 155 trillion naira by 2025. Despite reducing its debt ratio, service ratio, financial pressure remains. The United Nations Conference on Trade Development, UNCTAD, warns that rising debt limits spending on key sectors like education and healthcare, urging reforms for sustainable growth. How can Nigeria manage its debt without sacrificing essential public service? Joining us for insight is Samuel Atiku. Welcome, Samuel.
Thank you for having me on the program.
It's always great having you. Let's start with our first story. So we saw Nigerian leaders, including former President Olusegun Obasanjo and Peter Obi, express concerns that democracy in Nigeria is not functioning as it should be. They both argue that Western democracy is ineffective in Africa and require reforms to reflect cultural realities. So I want to start by asking you, what is your take? Do you agree with this point of view of our former leaders? And what are your opinions about the current democracy that we practice in Nigeria, especially in Africa?
Yeah, everybody, I would say everybody's entitled to his own opinion. But if we look at 10 critical mass features of democracy and we try to put it side by side with African culture and then our cultural beliefs, you'll see that they don't necessarily diverge significantly. We could start with the first one, which has to do with sovereignty, which talks about the fact that power ultimately resides with the people. Certainly, that encompasses what African culture is known for, right? If you look at the different tribes, the different ethnicity, people tend to flaunt that, and they will tell you that the government itself of that ethnicity or the person that is representing that ethnicity is actually just a representative of the people. So within the concept of democracy itself, the consent to govern must be derived from the people. And you must have heard the word, oh, the voice of man is the voice of God. That's an African tradition. So essentially, I will say that the concept of sovereignty, meaning that government derives its power from the people, is not strange to African culture. That's there, right? But we can raise questions around the kind of democracy we presently practice in Africa and say that, are we pulling away? Are we creating I'll call it a new mirror to actually call ourselves out? That's the first one. The second thing is the rule of law. That's the pinnacle of democracy itself. Everybody should be equal before the law. If you look closely at, for instance, the old Oyo Empire, you look closely at the Egbas, in the southwestern region, I think it's there for everybody to see. Even the king is subjected to the law of the land. Despite the fact that, yeah, people will say, oh, monarch could do one or two things. Those principles are there, right? I don't think they deviate significantly. You have to be transparent as a government. You have to rule with justice, meaning that you must make decisions that are seen as just. You actually have to make sure that the law is applied equally above all. Those are fundamental principles. The third one is the separation of power. Make sure that definitely there are separations. If you look at the African traditional beliefs, you will see that there's a separation of religion, there's separation of the administrative head, you have the military head, you have those separations already occurring by design. So we're not strange to all these things itself, having to separate the executive arm from the legislative arm from the judicial arm of government, and ensuring that there's check and balance across board. If you read the Oyo Empire, you will notice that definitely the king himself and the administrative head are subjected to the law of the land, and their systems for checks and balance have been put in place. We can look at judicial independence. Certainly, why you could say that, yeah, the executive arm seems to be buried into that in the African tradition, but the concept again is there that decisions should be independent, should not be influenced by money and all those things. And the judicial should protect citizen rights, right? They must resolve dispute fairly. They must enforce the law and the limit of government power. That's always been our African tradition. And I don't think it deviates significantly from democracy that we talk about. You talk about political pluralism and participation. We come up from a place in Africa where people are expected to actually veer their own different opinions. You don't have to align with what the king is saying. What you elect to practice in terms of trade is subjected to you. That's why you see different people with different ideology, people with different business. Oh, so sorry, please. Just 1 minute.
That's fine.
Yeah, so sorry, please. Yeah, I'm back to political pluralism and participation. In truth, we do not deviate significantly. The way Africa traditional culture is built is that people have multiple political ideologies and you decide to join different groups the way you deem fit. People should be free to participate in those political processes, right? That's why you see chiefs and all those things competing for power. You have different layers. For instance, in electing a king, you have different people pulling things around. And more importantly, there are diverse voices. People talk about things in different ways. People reason differently, and ensuring that each of their ideological, you don't force people and constrain people into one to think one way. I can run through it. I know I have a lot of things to say about this, but the point there is that the challenge we have today is that the kind of democracy that we are practicing, those which people can call it Western democracy, lacks this basic principle. Things like free and fair election, they're absent. Things like accountability and transparency are absent. Government is actively looking to actually suppress the voice of civil society and active citizenship. The equality before the law and political inclusion are not there. And again, if you put African tradition, you look at Western, they're not different. So my take here is that I think we're just dancing around the circle. The key thing we should focus our attention is the thing is right, ensuring that those key things, and I can list them out, those key things should be the anchor through which we build our society. One, ensuring that sovereignty actually rides with the people. Two, rule of law, separation of power, judicial independence, political pluralism and participation, protection of fundamental human rights, free and fair and regular election, accountability and transparency, civil society and active citizenship, and then more importantly, equality before the law and political inclusion. If we can build principles and laws around this and ensure we protect and we guide that jealously, definitely we'll not be having this conversation today.
Very true, very true. I do agree with you. And some of the challenges that we've been having is free and fair elections, free from violence, accountability and transparency, as well as inclusion, political inclusion, inclusion of women, youth, persons with disability in our governance structure as well. And as you said, equality before the law. Interesting points raised there. Let's move over to the second topic. So we had SBM recently released a report, A Threat to National Stability, how the escalating conflicts between herders and farmers community in Nigeria's middle belt has spread south, right, while maintaining its grip on the country's food basket. So this was released March this month. So can you tell us about the report and some of the key findings of this report as well?
I think it's clear if you look at the report, it aligns with what we most fear. I think one way or the other, climate issues that some people think is a hoax, right, doesn't exist. One way or the other, the whole idea around desertification in the north, reduction in grazing lands, and then the pastoralists moving down southwards is one way or the other impeding and affecting. It's affecting us, whether we like it or not. It's impacting significantly on the security of the country. Now, the question is that when this happened, have there been attempts in the past to correct it? I think we'll typically put plaster on broken bones and expect things to fix itself. Nigerian government have actually not done that in the past. We've not really put our voice, our words into actions and try to address these challenges. And that's why you see that this problem keeps escalating. And the work of mediation and inclusive dialogue seems to be absent. I think that's also one of the key things that come to light. Whether we like it or not, if there are contestation or there are conflict between 2-3 people, mediation and inclusive dialogue is critical. It's not that you elevate the voice of one people over the other. You must make sure you listen to both sides of the divide and try to find an amicable solution rather than pressuring other people to do. I think the talking thing again, which is at the heart of it, is the fact that we have massive security failure as a country. There are contexts around the impartiality, or which people call dual or tri or triple policing that we have in Nigeria, where certain people actually are elevated above other people in the scheme of things. It raised serious questions about our social cohesion as a country and how our security architecture is built. Is it built to actually protect everybody irrespective of where they come from? Or is it designed to favor some people when it's necessary? I think those are key questions that the report raised. I think there's a legal framework also and issues around land reforms that needs to be addressed. Things around grazing rights versus land tenure rules versus compensation mechanism around all those things. So my take here is that we are still, I think the conflict is still here. We need to address this issue. Oh, just 1 minute again. So sorry, I'm having a tough day today. Yeah, so sorry about this. Yeah, I think the big takeaway in the report is that the role of government, whether we like it or not, is it reinforced the fact that the government had failed multiple times, and every attempt and solutions that have been put on the table have not been carried out. And as such, the problem is now expanding aggressively. Of course, people are hiding under this thing to also perpetrate even more terrible atrocities. So that's at the heart of it. Until concerted effort is made by government to begin to address this issue, I think we'll be back to this conversation maybe in 2 years' time, and then more and more people will have been dead.
That's sad, really sad situation. To our readers, you can find this report on our website. It is really an interesting read, and you would see all the key findings and recommendations on how this issue can be stopped and to prevent an escalating crisis as well. So let's move on to our last story, where you had the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, warned that developing nations face record high external debt, right, reaching $11.4 trillion in 2023. And Nigeria's debt is projected to exceed 155 trillion by 2025. This is really concerning. What do you think Nigeria can do to balance our debt management in order for us to address the key things such as investing in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, as opposed to using most of our revenue to debt servicing?
I think it's a big question that you just raised now. We warned some years ago that we are on this trajectory, and then we find ourselves deep now in this. The solutions are clear, right? Just like you asked, so that I don't begin to rehash the problem. We need to broaden our revenue base. Now, thinking deeply at the structure of the Nigerian economy. For instance, if you take the GDPs are computed using two broad methodology. We look at GDP from the standpoint of what you call income, and then we look at it also from the expenditure perspective. If you look at GDP from expenditure perspective, you will notice that one of the biggest number that we have is around what I call it excess. I'll call it in quotes so that I don't dive, so that again, I'll just call it the profitability of people operating business in Nigeria. Now, the challenge we have is that people operating in Nigeria make a whole lot of money at the detriment, I repeat, at the detriment of people that are used to actually make that funds. And most of this money are carted away because government will typically give them this huge tax break, and then they leave them to actually run free. And the perception around this is that, oh, we're doing that because we want to attract more investment. But that comes at a big cost. It means that that man that will have earned extra money that should have been taxed, and then that money will go into government fund, is actually being shared away. And remember, the velocity of money is important. So just for context, because I'm paid 10,000 naira and I'm paying, for instance, out of my 10,000 naira, I'm paying 2,000 naira to the government, doesn't mean that there's a full stop there. That money will be spent. And once that money is spent, I have 10,000 today, I use it to pay this, I use it to pay school fees and all those things. That money again is reaggregated somewhere else and used to pay another person. And then the tax is collected, and then on and on like that. That's the velocity in which that money moves, one way or the other, could cumulatively expand. So at the end of the day, government may end up getting close to 20,000 naira from every 10,000 naira we make in terms of income from the manufacturing sector or for the goods producing sector. We can simulate this and actually, of course, make projections and tell people this. But the point is that when that money disappears from the society, because we fail to tax the extremely rich, and they take that money, they buy dollars, they take it outside the country, it means the ability for us to mobilize resources is limited. So to contextualize this, for a country to actually reduce its debt, we must begin to grow our revenue faster than we are accumulating debt. That's not the case as we speak. To get that done, we must expand our tax base. Not only expanding our tax base, we must also begin to ensure that that tax base is healthy and taxable. It's not that we continue to tax poverty. People that are poor, you continue to place more tax on them in the hope that you want to boost or something. That's one. Number two, the informal sector in Nigeria is massive, almost making up about 65–70%. And there was a time we did some research to understand how you tax the informal sector. One thing is clear around the informal sector. Number one, there are a lot of government revenue, in quote, I'll call it in quote because they are not defined as government revenue, that are being stolen away from the system. I can give you a good example. When you see a typical motorcycle, a person riding motorcycle, the kind of levy they pay through informal channels, through informal actors that government allow, which we call private accumulation, most of those funds are stolen away and allowed to actually filter because of political reasons. That man that is driving Okada is actually paying more tax than somebody earning at least roughly about somebody earning above 600, I mean, about 600,000 naira per month. That's how terrible it is. So an Okada rider beside you, in terms of if government actually legitimately collects that revenue that they are collecting from that person and put it in the coffers, that money is way bigger than what somebody earning 600,000 is paying in terms of tax. But that money that we are talking about never gets into government coffers. Even if some gets into that, it must have been stolen along the value chain. We need to put a end to all those nonsense and ensure that we have a system that works for us. We could talk about different tax streams. We could talk about the customs duty, their complexity around what we are doing there. We could talk about the systems for collecting VAT. There was a time I did propose one of the good ways to actually boot VAT, since people tend to like lottery, is to begin to build a culture where everybody demands receipts. And when you check up that receipt, you are ensuring that your VAT is actually remitted. And then, so how do you incentivize that? There are systems to incentivize that. You could learn from countries like Brazil that have made a system so that you just take your receipt, you enter the number of your receipt into a system, and you automatically enter into a lottery system. That, of course, if you like a lottery culture, you could use that to actually create a pool of funds, pool of evidence to challenge businesses that have not been remitting funds. So we need a lot of work around that, around the revenue angle. The second thing is our expenditure. We need to rein down on wasteful spending. I know, the concept of wasteful spending now has been disabused when you look at the United States. But again, whether we like it or not, we need to look closely at the size of our bureaucracies. For instance, how many steps do I have to take to actually obtain just my university degree in any university? Those steps, how do we cut that down? How do we simplify things? How do we use technology to actually make this trajectory? So we need to look closely at expenditure of government. How do we rationalize? How do we adjust this? How do we focus on just like you mentioned, how do we focus on high impact sectors like the health sector, the education sector, and the infrastructure sector? And then more importantly, how do we expand and improve our procurement bureau, transparency around our procurement system? Those are critical things, right? Number 3, I'll talk about this, is important, is our existing debt. If you look closely at the structure of the existing debt, majority of them are actually short-term borrowing. And because they are short-term borrowing, essentially the rate on it is ridiculously very high. Now, how do we begin to restructure this debt to ensure that we have a more sane way to pay off this debt and free up, I'll call it, some interest that we'll have paid if we had continued this trajectory? I think that's the job for the debt management office to actually look at. I don't want to talk about the SSCs around government also unusually collecting money from the central bank, printing money and inflating the society out of proportion. I will end by saying these 4 things, right? 1, we as a country need to attract private sector investment that will create jobs that pay tax, not just anyhow jobs. Don't bring in businesses that employs nobody, pay no tax, they suck out of the economy and they run away. That will not work. That's 1. Number 2, we need serious fiscal reforms and budget disciplines. We need to, personally, I believe Nigeria needs to actually move to performance-based budgeting, where our budget is actually anchored around critical thinking, not just umbrella one dash numbers that is being taught in. We need to cut off budget spending, things like off budget spending. You see a government official walking on the street and see somebody and say, oh, I'm giving this person 1 billion because it's a celebrity. We need to stop all those things. We need to intensify our anti-corruption efforts, and we need to actually regain fiscal credibility, ensuring that what we are saying we want to do, we're actually doing it. More importantly, I think there's a strong need to actually invest in our human capital development. We need to invest strategically in human capital. We need to improve our productivity, reduce our long-term dependency on debt, and by extension, we're increasing our revenue. I'll end by saying this. If Nigeria, the money that the president spent on yacht or one of these frivolous items, if we put it together That money could, in fact, train about 1 million people to become software engineers. Now, think about that for a minute. Imagine the money that we have wasted on one of these frivolous items had been directed to train 1 million young Nigerians, men, women, that are struggling one way or the other. We train them, we set a system, and then we train them to become software engineers. Some of them pick up all these remote jobs and all this kind of job. Look at the potential that could do in terms of the revenue stream that it will generate in the long term. Look at in terms of credibility that it brings to the country. And then by overall essence, when these people begin to spend in the economy, look at what it can do to actually elevate. So we need to think out of the box on how to use our young people to begin to turn Nigeria around and turn the country into a walking elephant that we should be, or even a soaring eagle, if you like to call it like that.
Very strong points you have raised there. Thank you. That's all for today. Thank you, Samuel, for bringing your thoughtful perspectives to this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Thank you so much.
You're welcome as always. To all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, like, and share. And let us know your thoughts in the comments. For deeper insights into our work, you can visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. Thank you for tuning in to the week ahead. For next week, this podcast will be airing on Fridays. See you next time.